How you doing? Joe Blaster here. We're getting ready to do retainers and springs on a 2022 GP 1800R. So we got the cowling off. As you can see, we're ready to go. First thing you got to do is disconnect that battery. Once you disconnect the battery, then you can start working on all your coils, injectors, and getting ready for the move using Super Tech. Catch you in a minute. Now, you never use an impact gun to install bolts, only to remove them. To get the coils off, you twist them lightly and then they pop right out. Now sometimes you get a little moisture that gets past this rubber seal here. So there's always a little expansion and contraction. That's why if you look right here, there's a little notch and a little notch. That's for air. As it heats up, air expands. As it cools off, it contracts. So this does breathe a little bit. Hence, you can get moisture into your spark plug. So I always spray a little silicone in there. That way, if any moisture gets in, silicone will keep that moisture from rusting your spark plugs. Now, if you look at everything, I am meticulous. I label everything. And by labeling everything, you can never go wrong. Recently, I saw in one of the groups, there was a question about those two little tiny bolts that hold your fuel rail. You don't need to remove those. If you look right above here, right behind the dipstick, there's a quick disconnect and a rubber grommet which is held by that actual bracket. You don't need to disconnect the bracket. Just disconnect that quick disconnect cover, pop off your fuel line, wiggle it right out of that rubber mounting grommet that acts like a shock grommet. Reduces vibration on your fuel line because you don't want to snap that neck, and then your whole fuel rail can come out. There's no reason for you to go digging behind that dipstick. The only reason to dig behind and underneath that dipstick, and I don't know if you can see it there, you have an oil line that goes to your hydraulic tensioner. It's a hydraulic chain tensioner. That keeps your timing. So you got to be real careful with that. And you need the whole intake out just to get that. You're not going to get to that with the intake on. These clips, all of those wire ties and all of those clips have to come off. Be very careful with your electrical connectors. The wires are not that thick. You could easily rip one out and damage it. they pop off gently. If you have to fight with one, you're doing it wrong. That hose also has to come off, and this whole cover. Now, as you see right there, that's your quick disconnect and your fuel line removed. There's the inlet, and right underneath it is that bracket that does not need to be removed. All right? If you're removing that bracket, you're creating problems. There's going to be extra pressure on that line. So you have to loosen your fuel cap and let a little air out of that tank, or else you're going to get a little squirt of fuel. A few drops are normal, but if there's pressure in the tank, that fuel line is going to squirt right in your face. So pay attention, take your time. It's not difficult. Now, this is what your intake should look like after you have unplugged all your electrical connectors. Cut your wire ties away. Don't let them fall in the hole. And then gently move your harness over to the ECM. In the next step, we're going to be taking that intake completely off. There's no reason to disconnect your fuel injectors. Leave them exactly where they're at. They'll come off with the whole intake. Intake is plastic, so treat it accordingly. Here's your whole intake out. As you see, where the fitting went, the bracket's still there. That's the vacuum for your blow-off valve. Throttle. And I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's a plate there in between the plastic intake and the throttle. That's the ribbon delete kit. It's a must for all supercharged engines. That ribbon comes loose. When I did mine, it was loose. So that's what it should look like. It's all one piece. Keep it clean, keep it out of the way. Now, when you look on this side, that's your intercooler. Your intake, everything should be clean. I'm going to be putting rags in the intake. I don't want anything falling in there. Anything that goes in the engine can cause catastrophic failure. Right there is your oil line. And at the bottom of that oil line is your chain tensioner, cam chain tensioner. That has to come off. It has to be reset. But that's at the end. There's your dipstick. To get to that cam chain tensioner, you got to loosen the dipstick. That's the only time you have to loosen the dipstick. Be back in a minute. All right, once you got everything off, now comes the work. You got to remove your jet pump. Slide it out a little bit, and with a 27mm wrench, combination wrench, you go in and you hook up to the impeller. The drive shaft is in the PTO, and you turn. And then you got to get up and check again, unless you have somebody helping you, until you get cylinder number 1 in top dead center. All right, you take your cam chain and you strap it with a bungee all the way up to your handlebars. You make sure it's tight and snug. before you remove your chain tensioner. I already removed that with the oil line. Now the next step is you label intake exhaust, even though it's stamped. Your cams, O is what I use for intake, X is what I use for exhaust. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 with a Sharpie. Then when you loosen the bolts, you have to loosen the bolts above the cams that don't have pressure coming from the valve springs. Once you loosen those, then you can gently loosen the ones that have pressure from the valve springs. Those should be your center pistons, 2 and 3. And then you go back, loosen the cam on the outside a little more, then go on the inside and loosen it a little more. The reason for this is because the cam is under pressure from the valve springs. And you don't want to go crazy unscrewing one side and twisting these cam plates. And you're not going to bend the cam itself because that's forged. But you're causing unnecessary tension in areas that you shouldn't be. You got to remember this, the block, the head, everything is cast aluminum. So you can gouge it with a screwdriver, with a wrench, with too much pressure, and that changes everything. If you look in the front here, your cam lobes are facing 180 degrees apart from each other. That's top dead center. And then your mark here, top dead center. Your mark here, top dead center. It has to be very, very close to the mark. Now castings are a little off. If it's off by a few thousandths, it's not a big deal, because a tooth on your gear is probably the difference of a 32nd. So you have to look at the total picture. That dot, top dead center, is lined up. This dot, top dead center, is lined up. I already checked cylinder number 1 being at top dead center, and both lobes are pointed 180 degrees apart from each other. If they were pointed inward, that would be a false top dead. Cams removed. The chain is secured. If you can see all the way down there, you don't want to drop your chain all the way down there. Now, each one of these caps has a shim, and that shim is your valve lash. Each one of those may be different, may be the same, and that is set up when the head is being set up with the cams on 0 lash. You have feeler gauges that are entered, and that is your separation from the top of these caps to your spring, which is connected to your valves. And those shims are your valve lash. You don't want to mix these up. This is extremely crucial. You have to number these, separate them on a table. Every single one has to go back in exactly the way it came out, or else your lash, your valve lash, will be completely off. Your ski will not run correct. You could possibly hit a valve with your piston. You don't want to do that. So you must be meticulous Every single one, you have to have it has to be separated and numbered and go back in exactly the way you took it out, or else you have to check the valve lash on every single one of these valves. And that's a long, tedious process that you don't need to get into. So you need an area that you can put these out where nobody's gonna touch them. No pets, no kids, no dogs, no wife, no nothing. Here you have a spring seat, a spring, and a retainer, all stock. And then here you have the upgraded version, the upgraded spring seat, the upgraded spring, and the titanium retainer. If you go over here, here's one I just put in. And here's one I'm about to put in. And here is the spacer that you can't lose. And that goes right in the center there. And the cap goes on top. All right, guys. Here I have my cams, everything set up. My springs that I removed. I already have the SuperTech springs and retainers in. So this is all ready to go back, minus these stock springs and retainers. There's my chain tensioner. I already twisted it in. And there's a little clip there that gets popped once everything is situated. You see how everything is organized? Exactly the way it's going back in. All my valve spring caps are in. All these little marks are Sharpie marks. Everything was labeled as I took it out. I'm not going to show you how I got the retainers in. That's too long and tedious. I can't hold the camera. But everything is here. It all went back in exactly the way it went out. So now I have some assembly lube on there. And everything is ready to go back together again. So when you're setting up, reinstalling your cams, and you're setting up your chain, you pull up on the chain, removing all the slack off of it, while at the same time lining up your timing mark right there as I'm showing you. You wire tie the chain onto the sprocket. You take the slack off the chain. You set up the other sprocket while lining up the other timing mark. Then you wire tie it to the sprocket. All of your slack is on this side where the chain tensioner is at. Now you have to screw in your chain tensioner, and there's a little tiny clip that holds it in place, and then it allows you to install it. Once it's installed, you have to go in through here, right through here, with a screwdriver, and you tap the tip of the chain tensioner, and that causes the clip to let loose, and then it pushes the tensioner into the guide, and the guide takes the rest of the slack off. So once again, there's no slack on this side. There's no slack here. There's no slack on the top. There's no slack here. All of your slack is on this side. Now, my engine remained at top dead center. You don't move it. You don't change it. Once you found your top dead center, you don't turn your crank without your cams being installed. I'm ready to put the intake back on. Now is your opportunity. If you haven't, remove that ribbon. Ribbon delete mod is absolutely necessary. I already did mine. Mine was loose. Then, whether you're ready for a blow-off valve or not, you could always cap this off, but now's the best time to put your fitting in. Now, there's another solution to that, where Works sells an adapter where you can go off this sensor and tap into that. That's fine. Some people, they cut this hose right here. They put a T in for the blow-off valve. What happens is that at high RPM, your map sensor can send bad data, and it's a bad choice, in my opinion. I know a lot of you guys have done that and you don't have any problems with it. I find that you get bad readings off that map sensor and it sets off all kinds of alarms. It's just a pain. Why cause yourself problems when it's very easy to tap and put a fitting in on this side? As you see, my whole intake is on. It's torqued to spec. Fuel line is back on. Chain is tensioned. Cams have been torqued down for a while now. Everything's clean. Now coming over here, you have a nylon chain guide, which is part of the chain tensioning system. It sits right here. Now the problem with it sitting right there is that when you flip this over to install it, and it doesn't want to come out now, it's making me a liar, but when you flip it over, this falls off. So what I do is I give it a good lubing with ultra slick assembly lube. This is very sticky. When I turn this upside down to install it, that guide is not going to come loose. So, I got the pump back on, ride plate back on, everything's secure, greased up, oiled up, extended nozzle, opened up to 90 millimeters. That's my own design, free flow exhaust. With the silicone hoses, it eliminates a lot of the drone. Not all of the drone, but most of the drone. There's my line for cooling. Next, I'll be getting an upgraded intercooler. I haven't decided on the Fizzle or the Riva intercooler. Everything tied up, everything buttoned up, ready to go. All set up. Next time you hear from me, I'll be testing it out in the water.